And thank you for showing up in great numbers to hear my reflections on the issue of refugees. I have to declare, however, that I'm not an expert on refugees. I did read up in preparation for this morning, because while I deal with refugee crisis through my work, and a lot of my colleagues are working on a day-to-day basis in refugee and displaced situations, to be an expert, I mean, there's a whole study. You can go to Oxford and study refugee studies. And I am more of a practitioner, if you want. So if you come with very legal questions around refugee status, I think the introduction that was given earlier today, the person who did that is far more the expert. But who is expert in a time that a lot of certainties are wiped away and where we genuinely all feel like, what can we do? What is it that we are called to do? And I think certainly as Christians, what we are called to do. So I come to you with my experience, with a knowledge of a lot of situations, fairly superficial, but hopefully we'll be able to share a few perspectives that can help us think about the situation. I do feel it's important that we contextualize what we are talking about also from a biblical point of view. And we can go back to the Torah, the first books of the Bible, book of Leviticus, saying, when a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. So, even when we think about Jesus and his parents were refugees. They spent time in Egypt as they had reasons to fear for the life of the newborn. Perhaps Abram, leaving behind the certainties of Mesopotamia, ending up in Canaan. Perhaps he fled harsh environmental conditions in search of a land of milk and honey. Many of the early Christians were refugees. And I believe the Bible is absolutely unambivalent about what we are tasked to do. We have to respect and look after the stranger in our midst. We are to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and love our neighbors as ourselves. Towards the end of this brief introduction, I will come back to some more practical issues. So what can we do? Try to translate the theory into action in the face of the current refugee crisis. But talking about refugees, that's my task, so I need to focus on the issue. And there are, as I said, there's a whole body of law and international conventions governing defining what a refugee is and giving certain protection. And bear with me, I'll just quote to you the 1951 Refugee Convention of the United Nations. The definition of a refugee is someone who, owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable or owing to such fear unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country, or who, not having a nationality and being outside the country of his former habitual resident as a result of such events, is unable, owing to such fear, to return. Now, it seems to me that the world has moved on a little bit since 1951, because I don't think refugees are only men. Language here is certainly not a language that would pass today. But everything we're talking about, what the media is referring to, the politicians are working towards or hiding behind, still is rooted in these refugee conventions that were made after World War II, where people said never again. But we have come to realize that refugees are not only refugees because of violence. In our work, Christian Aid, certainly we see the phenomenon of environmental refugees. People who have been forced to leave their traditional habitat temporarily or permanently because of a marked environmental disruption, natural or man-made. I think it's important that we keep that in mind. Still, on the issue of definition, just to contextualize, because there's refugees and then there are asylum seekers. So what distinguishes the two? An asylum seeker is someone who submits a request for refugee status. So in order to get recognized as a refugee, you have to seek asylum. Now, the right to asylum can only be claimed once you have managed to reach the country where you want to seek asylum. And in the recent past, it used to be that people entering, for example, a British embassy in a particular country could declare that they needed the protection of the British government and sought asylum. And from that moment onwards, they would be under the protection until the refugee status was cleared. But I don't know about you, but I do visit different countries at times and visit British embassy and high commissions in some places. There's no way you can just enter because there's high walls and security. So even someone who would wish to seek asylum cannot gain access. There's no way. You can only gain access to this country if you are a refugee, probably under false pretenses, saying that you come for business and then and if you are granted entry in the first place, if you don't have money, you can't get entry from many countries. So maybe to reflect that once upon a time, churches were places of asylum. There's many cathedrals where there still are a knocker on one of the gates of the cathedral, or particular column in the church where once people touched it, they had the right to asylum. And then we're not talking about necessarily people fleeing for their political beliefs. That also included murderers. The church no longer can claim that role legally, but I do think we still have a moral responsibility as a church to think about how we can help people in claiming asylum. And the whole debate about refugees, of course, is muddled or made more difficult because we do not only deal with refugees and asylum seekers, we also deal with economic migrants. An economic migrant is someone who travels from one country to another in order to improve their standard of living and to get a job. I'm one. I'm born in Holland. I came to this country because I had a job here. And makes me an economic migrant, probably. Doesn't mean that I necessarily have bettered my chances to make money or something like that, but we are surrounded by people who are economic migrants. So how do we distinguish economic migrants from refugees? Lumping them all together is not helpful, but at the same time, global developments mean that a clear distinction between categories is not easy to make. Because the UN protocols date back from just the post-World War II situation, where there was no point. Thinking about someone from Afghanistan seeking asylum or being a refugee in Europe never crossed people's mind. Because at most, people from Afghanistan will seek asylum or become refugees in Iran or in Pakistan, but Europe was never in the picture. So the other problem is that all refugee law and the rules around asylum are about individual cases. So when you deal with mass movements of people, how do you determine the refugee status of the individuals within that group? If they have to follow the law, which of course government officials have to, interpret the law, they have to do that on an individual basis. 50,000 people about to cross from Syria into Turkey, being held at the border. Would that mean 50,000 people having their individual cases reviewed? That's the struggle we are in at the moment. So many of the current mechanisms guiding governments on how to handle refugees are good on paper, but are no longer fit for purpose when it comes to a mass movement of people, as they're based on refugees as individual cases. But important to remember that international law is based on human rights, and those are still as relevant as ever. We should not forget that all those people crossing in little boats, all those people fleeing, whether it's for economic reasons or because they have reasons to fear for their life, they have rights. And I would like to add, and all those people are made in God's image. We are obliged to honor God's image in everyone. Let's come back briefly to the issue of economic migrants. For people like myself, it was a positive choice. It was very easy, and I didn't meet any barriers. But if I were a young person in Afghanistan, maybe a high school graduate in Afghanistan, a young man, I finish high school, and then there are no jobs. I see how my parents have bled for my education. I see the grinding poverty that they are living in. And I have a choice to join one militia or the Taliban or getting recruitment in the government army. Are those choices? Can we say that the young person who decides to pack up his bags and leave for what he knows is a better world, does that make him an economic migrant? It's a rational choice. If you are a young person in Eritrea, I think men and women in this case, and you're in your 10th year of conscription, when you cannot marry the one you love, you don't know when your conscription ends, you live under a government that does not respect your rights, and one day you start walking and you cross the border, does that make you an economic migrant? Those distinctions are not easy to make. And of course, in the media, it is presented, these people come to get our social welfare, all the things that we are very proud of and very protective of. But given the hardship that they have to endure in their journey to come anywhere near Europe, I don't think it's an issue of simply dividing between the deserving and the undeserving, the refugees that have genuine reasons to fear for their lives, or the economic migrants who are after betterment of their life. The boundaries, the distinctions are very, very difficult to make. So let's not fool ourselves. No one leaves their home, their country, the place they grew up in, for frivolous reasons. All those migrants have a place they call home, or they once called home, but it's not recognizable anymore. Also, those economic migrants, they would probably love to be in a place where they have their friends, where they have their family, but the one missing ingredient is hope. And I think hope as a profoundly Christian theme is something that we need to keep in mind here. When people face situations of hopelessness, they will do things rationally, which is to try to find a place that offers more hope. Now, the problem has come to our attention because refugees are in Europe after many, many decades of hardly having any significant numbers of refugees. But UNHCR estimate that the world had 19.5 million recognized refugees, excluding 5.1 million Palestinians who are refugees already for more than 70 years and therefore are almost not included because of their extended refugee status. Then there are at least 38.2 people internally displaced, and you have asylum seekers. And all these figures are in a way meaningless because on a daily basis, as we heard earlier this morning, those figures are going up. But the focus at the moment is very much on Syria and on Europe. But a country like Sudan and South Sudan, 2.5 million internally displaced in South Sudan. Did we hear about that? Do we have sleepless nights about that? A country very dear to my heart, Burundi, currently going through a political crisis. There are 10, 20, 30,000 people in camps in Tanzania, in Rwanda, in the DRC. There are probably hundreds of thousands of people not in camps, but staying with family, staying with ordinary poor people. The majority of displaced people in the world are not even registered. They are being looked after by people often as poor as themselves. Now that, I think, should put us collectively to shame if we realize that people who have nothing can find it in their heart to share that little that they have with people who have lost everything. We find it very difficult to share our wealth with people who have lost everything. So the global refugee crisis is bigger than the crisis that Europe is encountering at the moment. Jordan, not the poorest of countries, 1 in 3 people in that country is a refugee. Lebanon, 1 in 4 is a refugee. Britain, 1 in 500 something, I don't know. So if we talk about sacrifice and if we talk about we do so much, I think it would put us in a better light if we maintain some humility. And in the future, we're actually looking also at countries where we know there are going to be major people movements of people moving, trying to move out. Bangladesh, because of sea level rise. Pacific Islands, okay, we're only talking about a few 100,000 people, but there are already islands in the Pacific that have become uninhabitable, and people have moved between islands. They will not show up on the shores of this country, but where will they go when they've lost their home through no fault of their own? Other countries where water scarcity, I read a story about Bolivia, whole areas of highland Bolivia are becoming uninhabitable because water is no longer available, because the glaciers have melted and the regular supply of water is not there anymore. The conditions for life are not there anymore. These people will not show up on our doorstep. They will probably be housed by people as poor as themselves. So, this is my effort to try to sort of sketch a picture that is broader than only the European crisis and give a bit of background. So what's the problem? The problem that we are encountering at the moment is that the international system that used to regulate the flow of refugees and displaced is no longer fit for purpose, no longer fit for the current reality. Let's not throw out of the window what we have, but politicians that say, well, we have to follow the rules, are ignoring the fact that the rules cannot meet the challenge. So we need to think out of the current system. And it's not like there's an answer out there, but it requires real courage and honesty to say, we don't know. Because at least then we can start collectively to think, okay, what can we do? But by hiding behind conventions, by hiding behind the rule book says this, then actually it is an invitation to do nothing, or to actually say it's someone else's problem. So the systems that came about after World War II still do provide the safeguards and has informed the principles that have preserved life and dignity, and it's rooted in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But because of its focus on individual cases, it's difficult to see how this can respond to the new global realities. The European system was based on the need to have fair process of dealing with relatively small numbers of displaced people. Greece, under the best of circumstances, could process 1,500 refugees a month. Refugee arrivals in the past year have often exceeded that number on a daily basis. So we can't start from an assumption that we can pick and choose. Countries like Greece do not have the facilities or the resources to absorb the number of people currently arriving on their shores. Germany took brave action, but as a consequence, the disproportionate numbers that suddenly arrive overwhelm the system, and the local population is often unprepared to accept the new strangers in their midst. And we cannot approach this problem as it is someone else's problem. In a globalized world, where every country seeks to benefit from the opportunities offered by global connections and trade, we can't turn our back and pretend that the issue is not ours. There are no simple solutions or quick fixes. Joint political leadership and action is required, and we need to start at the source. Ultimately, how do you solve a problem like Syrian refugees is by bringing about peace in Syria. Easier said than done. But peace processes, promoting good governance and economic development, job creation, all of that is part of the solution. The millions of young people leaving relatively good education in many, many countries ending up without a perspective of ever getting a job, you can't blame them for going looking for jobs, even if that means crossing continents. But let's come to some practical action. On the plight of the refugees and economic migrants, some principles have been learned in the sector where I work, from disaster relief and development, working with displaced communities over many, many years. There's a body of knowledge that my organization benefits from and that we try to promote with the whole sector. First, whatever we do, prioritize the safety and dignity and avoid causing harm. Prevent and minimize as much as possible any unintended negative effects of interventions, which can increase people's vulnerability to both physical and psychosocial risks. These people are vulnerable. Protect their dignity. They're not cattle, they're not swarms, they're not bunches. They are people with rights and dignity. In everything we do, even if we are there with empty hands, can we respect their dignity? That's where it starts. The causing no harm has a lot to, I'll come back to that. That is also to deal with how do you deal with communities that suddenly feel overwhelmed by arrivals of refugees. Second, meaningful access to assistance and services in proportion to need without any barriers, i.e. no discrimination. Too often in situations of displacement, the strong men are at the front of the queue getting all the relief goods. Where does that leave the disabled? Where does that leave women with children? Where does that leave single women who sometimes have to sell their bodies in order to get access to relief goods? We cannot tolerate that. We need to be very mindful of the way that we provide assistance. So meaningful access to assistance and service in proportion to need without any barriers, and pay special attention to individuals and groups who may be particularly vulnerable or have difficulty accessing assistance and services. Thirdly, what I call accountability. That seems a bit of a luxury term in the midst of all of this, but it's about actually, did we ask people what they needed? And have we gone back to them to ask, was it the right thing? Too often we assume that we know what people need. It's a reason, for example, that my organization in Serbia at the moment deals with vouchers. Instead of handing out food and clothing, we give people vouchers, which they can spend in the bakery, they can spend in the railway station, or they can spend in the pharmacy. But the dignity of making that choice is left to the people concerned. And indeed, many bought tickets to try to get to Germany. That's their right, that's their choice. Others have prioritized making the best of what the circumstances offer and get food. Lastly, and that is already linked to the issue of accountability, is that of participation and empowerment. Support the development of self-protecting capacities and assist people in claiming their rights, including the right to shelter, food, water and sanitation, health and education. one of the tragedies of the current situation is that there are tens of thousands of children not receiving education because they are refugees, because they're not recognized. They are in camps. God knows what skills they learn there, apart probably from surviving. But it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. It doesn't have to be all very tragic, because where some will win and some will lose, actually there are situations that can create opportunity. There are win-win situations. Let's be honest, many countries, and Germany actually recognized that, many countries have a problem in that the bulk of their population is in the older age category. They don't have enough young people to work in the care homes. They don't have enough people who will pay the taxes that will maintain their social security. If you have a young refugee population, it can be a stimulus to the economy. The Swiss, always out to make a good buck, did a very cold calculation, and it works out for them that they say if we accept a certain number of refugees, it will stimulate the economy. So we should not look at it as these people come for our welfare system, will put pressure on schools and housing, which may well be true. But it has also a positive side. People can contribute, and they will contribute. They're not coming here to sit on their backside and wait for things to be brought to them. I heard an absolutely painful interview with an Eritrean doctor who had lost her asylum application. She had been in this country for many years. A trained doctor who was not allowed to work because she was an asylum seeker. She cost the state an enormous amount of money, even though it's a pittance on a weekly basis, I think 15 pounds or something like that. And of course her housing and everything, all the case workers and everything, that woman has cost Britain money. She's there with her skills as a doctor, and even if she would be asked to work as a care assistant, she would have been grateful to do so, but she was not allowed. There's perversion in the system here. A lot of the refugees have skills. So, refugees and economic migrants, often young and willing to work, including willing to do the kind of work that most of us don't want to do. Many refugees and economic migrants have skills, and for as long as their status is not formally recognized, they have to sit on their hands. Now think of the host population. Let's take Greece. Overwhelmed, a country on its knees, economic crisis, we all know about it. And there are all these refugees. Now, what if we were to help the refugees where they are, where they've landed, and give them vouchers, for example, say, okay, with this voucher you can buy bread. So instead of flying in bread and shipping in all the goods from outside, stimulate the local economy. The baker can bake more bread, can have bigger income, can stimulate the local economy. The worst we can do, particularly, I'm not talking about Calais here, but I'm talking about people in Greece, in the large displaced population. The worst we can do is sending the goods from here to there, because we are not stimulating the economy by that way. I'm reminded of the Asian tsunami of 2004, when there were collections in my own village in Oxford where people were asked to buy toothpaste and soap so it could be sent to Sri Lanka. First of all, it's extremely expensive to buy toothpaste and soap in this country. Put it on a plane, and the British government, wisely or unwisely, paid for it, and then it was given out to victims of the disaster. If we had given the money there for people to buy soap and toothpaste, we would have brought the economy in a better situation because of this tragedy. It would still have been a stimulus to the economy. And too often our knee-jerk reactions get in the way of sensible solutions. So think of the host population. They might benefit, and we need to look for ways that they benefit. Otherwise, those refugees are the enemy. They will compete for the scarce resources. And you can't blame the Greek people for thinking that. So, as I said, avoid knee-jerk reactions. Over the summer, a truckload of bottled water was sent from this country to Greece. I do not want to challenge the impulse that gave rise to that, because I believe it is about people wanting to make a difference, a positive difference. But I think about it as totally, utterly wrong. Don't start shipping things from this country if it can be done locally. So, okay, I'll come to that. Let me just finish my train of thought. My apologies for that. But wrongly targeted or inappropriate aid is costly, ineffective, and doesn't also assume that people can determine for themselves what they need. And we have learned that the hard way. So, in short, start at the source, look at the root causes, but be honest about what we can do in times of major conflict. We may be powerless, but at least admit to our powerlessness and then start from our knees, start trying to discern what is there that we can do if we can't change the big developments. Development is more than nice little projects. It is not about helping one family here and saying we've done our job. Think of the scale. You have to work proportionate to scale. Treat refugees and economic migrants with respect and preserve their dignity. And avoid the soft options that lead to future problems. And this might be controversial, but I'm thinking of that Britain is being lobbied to accept 3,000 unaccompanied children. That's good, because those children are currently at risk. But if we think we've done the job by accepting 3,000 unaccompanied children, all those children have families. And there's nothing worse than to create an orphan situation where the children can still be looked after by their family. Accepting 3,000 unaccompanied children implies that we are prepared to accept their families as well. Otherwise, you perpetuate a separation of children from their parents from the children, children from their siblings. They will be problems into the future. We had a situation in Congo several years ago after a major displacement. We were asked to support an orphanage that was set up where there were 300 children who were displaced after one of the outbreaks of violence. And we said, sorry, we don't do orphanages. It's a bit of a standard answer, but at the same time, we couldn't walk away from the situation because there was the reality of 300 children who needed care. So we accepted the care of the orphans under the condition that every effort would be made to reunite them with their families. And within a year, all those children were reunited with their families. We could have accepted the orphanage and fed them and taught them and cared for them, and we would still be caring for them now. But actually by involving the church and saying, let's look for the parents, we went on the radio stations, we went through all kind of ways to try to link children with their families, and we were able to reunite all of them. So let's be careful that we don't make we go for the soft option, accept unaccompanied children, and then refuse their families. That would be absolutely wrong. In all of this, remind politicians of their responsibility and tell them that we care. And then the issue of crime, which is very real. Go after the people smugglers. Punish them. Punish the people who benefit from people's misery. And when economic migrants or refugees misbehave, treat them like you would treat anyone who misbehaves. And use every opportunity that you get to educate. So what can we do? What can the church do? What are we doing to welcome the stranger in our midst? Are we showing compassion? Everyone does not need to do everything. But as Christians, we cannot start from the point of view that it is someone else's problem. Yes, it's a governmental responsibility, but we have to do our bit. We can work with, listen to refugees. Very wise words are spoken by the survivors of the Kindertransport, the Jewish children who were evacuated from Germany in 1938, who came to this country. Doctors, lawyers, members of parliament, people in the House of Lords. These were seen as, well, basket cases, children that we had to look after in this country, while there were enough problems in this country already. They ended up being, apart from saving their lives, I should say, they ended up being very valuable members of society. So maybe listen to their stories before we judge. And ask them what made the biggest difference in rebuilding their lives in this country, and try to act accordingly. I'm always reminded of my mother, my late mother, when there was an influx of Turkish Turkish migrants in a small rural town in Holland in the 1970s. And lots of tensions. And through the church, she ended up doing language classes with Turkish women. Now, those women thereby were able to see the humanity of their host community, the community that they ended up in, and actually developed a lot of friendship. So there are things we can do, and it does not necessarily involve very complicated things. Simply reaching out to people where they are, interacting, that's important. Money and resources are necessary, but it's all too easy to start there. Find out first, and where possible, ask those with first-hand experience before deciding on action. Inform yourselves, fight and challenge ignorance. Unfortunately, the headlines in the Daily Mail of 1938 and 2015-16 are not very different. Refugees are trying to get into this country to get hold of what we have. And the warning against a flood of Jewish refugees from continental Europe in 1938, there are echoes here that we should be very, very careful about. We are all citizens. We can use our full rights and exercise our responsibilities, and politicians are answerable to us. Expect intelligent engagement. Do not settle for quick fixes, and be very wary of those who claim that there are simple solutions. And I'm not even including here the people who have said, let them drown. I don't think any responsible politician has said that, but it's out there. And let's reflect on our own blessings and then decide on our course of action. Remember what Jesus said as what really matters. The greatest commandment is this, you know it. Luke 10, the Good Samaritan, who's my neighbor? If we don't recognize the neighbor in the faces of the refugees and the displaced or the economic migrants, doesn't mean we have to agree with them, doesn't mean we have to give them everything they're asking for, but if we do not recognize them as our neighbors, we have no right to talk and certainly not to call ourselves Christians. I think I leave it there. At the end, there will be a handout where it's a bit of a summary of the things I've said, which gives some indication around giving, acting, and praying. What can we do? But no one, honestly, I believe, is totally powerless in the face of the challenges. We all have power. Thank you.
So I'm going to ask for questions, so you've got your...
Thank you very much. It was a brilliant talk that you gave. I'm descended from East Russian Jews who migrated from there to escape Russian persecution, and if they hadn't done, they would have probably been killed by the Holocaust some generations later. The thing that I'm really worried about, and want to throw open kind of, do you have any thoughts on this, is that the sorts of things being portrayed in the media around sexual assaults, perhaps fear of people from poorer backgrounds from which I came, feeling that refugees are going to take the very little parts of the pie that we have in this society, is kind of going to fuel the sort of rhetoric of the English Defence League, National Front and whatever. And, you know, how can we address that? Because I believe that if we do what Cologne did, which was try and sit on news reports about those sexual assaults and not have them come out into the open, people think, oh God, you know, this is all conspiracy. Sorry, I'm not sounding very articulate, but I am really, really concerned because I understand from being from a poor background what it feels like not to have much of a piece of the pie. But equally, you know, the EDF opinions and National Front opinions aren't the answer. Yeah. Sorry.
I get your point, and I think we should be very honest about when it is wrong, it's wrong. And there's no point in hiding it. But I also think we need to be very mindful of those who then take up the cause of, let's say, European women, as if rape is uniquely to asylum seekers and refugees. There are thugs going around the streets of Finland defending the Christian heritage of Finland, and they call themselves the defenders of Odin, so it seems to be a bit of a contradiction there. Actually, most of them have a criminal record or have been charged with domestic violence. So, wrong is wrong. Let's not mince words about that, but let's also use every opportunity to educate. If you are a young man and you're surrounded by other young men and you have lived in a great situation of great tension and you suddenly feel that you're surrounded by a very liberal world where everything seems possible, you may make wrong choices. So I think it's also about how do we educate, do we give people something to do, or are we condemning people to sit in camps which just become pressure cookers, and certainly where there's a large congregation of young men not having to do anything, they'll get up to some mischief, and it shouldn't be that gets directed at young women in the host community. But I think honesty about it and let the law applies. Even if it's a refugee, it doesn't put them above the law. They still have to respect the rules of the country that they're in.
It's a question about Palestinian refugees. You mentioned this, and they, it seems to me, are God's forgotten people, and have become even more so, of course, in the light of the present refugee crisis. And I wonder whether you have anything to say about how this great injustice could be redressed. I mean, in terms of seeing them as needy people in terms of the refugee crisis. And the second part of the question relates to Christian Aid's work in that part of the world, which I have heard has been reduced, the work in Palestine. And I wonder if you could comment on, if that is so, why that is so.
Okay. On the latter issue, I'm not aware of any reduction. There may be that certain partners are not maintained, and that is often having different reasons from it's not moving away from the issue. We are in Gaza, we are in the West Bank, and we are working with Israelis on issues of human rights in their own country. So we are not walking away from that situation. It is my genuine hope that the focus on refugees currently will ultimately also result in more focus for the long-term crisis that the world prefers to ignore. And the Palestinians are probably the most prominent among those, but we still have hundreds of thousands of people displaced in Colombia, 50 years of civil war, people who no longer have a sense of home because the place where they're originally from does no longer mean anything to them. So there are some long-term crises that we are very aware of, and perhaps we should, dare I say, use the current situation to remind the world that some problems haven't gone away. We have worked for many decades with refugees on the border of Thailand and Myanmar, Burma. Now, hopefully, we can start to work on a situation of accompanying these people going back. But even that is now such a problem because they have lived in camps for several generations. They have often lost the ability to see a life for themselves outside the camp. So their prison has become their home. And so you can't just say, okay, border open, go back, now everything is fine. People need to go back to a place where there is hope. And I think hope for us is at the heart of this. Can we offer people hope? And too often in refugee situation that is lacking. There was a gentleman at the back who wanted to raise a question. I'm very sorry that I did not answer at the moment.
No, my apology for interrupting. My question really is about timescale, which is perhaps partly leading into that, is that I think responsibility for something that happened decades previous is quite difficult. I mean, for instance, the Palestinians are caused by what Israel did in the 1940s. And if you like, climate change is partly what happened in the UK in the Industrial Revolution. And having responsibilities for issues that go back in time kind of dilutes, but yet the consequences are still very real today. Have you got anything to sort of enlighten us on how to get past responsibilities relevant to action today?
I think it's very difficult to translate it into a formal responsibility or a legal responsibility. So I think we're talking more about a moral responsibility. And in that sense, one humanity, and we have to live with the mistakes of previous generations without necessarily always blaming those previous generations, because there may have been reasons that also people were manipulated or people did not control certain things. For me, it goes back to who am I in this world today? How do I live my life? What are the choices that I make? How do I interpret my own faith in this world? And that does not necessarily mean I'm taking the burden of everything that's wrong in the world and I'm trying to solve everything. But not doing anything, I think, is the worst. So we can't walk away from situations saying, it's not of my making, it's people in the past, I have nothing to do with it. That, for me, is not walking away from it and being honest about what we can do rather than focusing on what we can't do. It's not a satisfactory answer, but I hope you get what I'm after here.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you all for your participation. I'm sure we could go on for much longer, but we've run out of time, so we have to call it in there. So thank you to you all.